Welcome back. This is the second lecture for the Advanced Pollinator Training Module for the Hawaii Master Gardeners on pollination biology. If you're just joining us and intend to complete the advanced certification, please be sure to take the pre-test before continuing, which is located on the course homepage. If you haven't done so already, be sure to complete Quiz 1. By the end of this module, you will have a detailed understanding of the process of pollination, be able to identify various pollination syndromes, understand the main insect and animal groups responsible for pollination, and be able to identify the major insect pollinators of Hawaiian crops. Being master gardeners, all of you have observed bees and other insects visiting flowers and collecting pollen or nectar. When we see this, we think to ourselves, hey look, that flower is being pollinated. But what's really going on when pollination happens? The definition of pollination is the process of pollen moving from the male part of the flower to the female part, which results in fertilization. This is effectively sexual reproduction in plants, as opposed to asexual or vegetative reproduction, where a plant effectively clones itself. The two parts of the flower essential for sexual reproduction are the stamens and pistil. The stamens are the male part of the flower, and the anther is what produces pollen. The female part of the flower is the pistil. The stigma, which is the part facing outward, is what receives the pollen grains. When pollen grains land on the stigma, they undergo a process called germination and grow a single pollen tube down into the style, which conveys the DNA from the pollen down to the ovary, where fertilization occurs. The ovary is what eventually turns into a fruit. Flowers that have the male and female parts present are considered bisexual, and this accounts for approximately 80% of all angiosperms, or flowering plants. Cross-pollination is when pollen from one plant is transported or received by a separate and genetically distinct plant. Many plants have a degree of self-compatibility, meaning they can fertilize themselves with their own pollen, but they do rely mostly on outcrossing or cross-pollination for upwards of 80% of their own reproduction. This can be achieved through biotic processes, meaning the pollen is moved by animals such as bees, or abiotically, meaning the pollen is moved by either wind or water. For wind pollination to be successful, you need a lot of the same species within a region, as pollen can be carried much farther by wind than an insect would otherwise fly. However, production of lots of pollen would be biologically wasteful for a plant if there were lots of other plant species present, as it would become less and less likely that the dispersed pollen would reach another plant of the same species. This is why wind pollination becomes a more dominant form of pollination the closer you get to the North and South poles, or the higher you go in elevation, because the warmer period of time when insects would be flying is too short for them to complete their life cycle. In island systems where pollinating insects are also relatively rare, the wind can be an important pollination vector for certain species. Wind-pollinated flowers tend to be unisexual, meaning a flower is distinctly male or pollen-producing, or female, meaning it receives the pollen, as opposed to having male and female structures in the same flower, as previously discussed for bisexual flowers. The male flowers will open first, with the wind catching and dispersing the pollen. Then the female flowers open to receive the airborne pollen. This biology limits the plant from fertilizing itself. Examples of wind-pollinated plants in Hawaii are grasses and some species of palms. Biotic agents of cross-pollination include birds, bats, honeybees, solitary bees, pollinating flies, beetles, and butterflies. In Hawaii, flowers evolved in the absence of many insect pollinators, including social hymenopterans, which include honeybees and bumblebees. Beetles actually play an important role in native plant pollination as a result, since it was much easier for them to colonize the islands as opposed to their bee counterparts. Birds have historically been important pollinators in the islands too, particularly the honey creepers. We do have one native species of bat in Hawaii, the Hawaiian hoary bat, or Opeapea, but this is a species that eats insects and does not pollinate flowers. Animals, for the most part, have a high level of control over their own reproduction. In birds, for example, males will use showy displays to attract females, and she will make a decision to mate with the showiest male. Plants can't exactly uproot and seek out their ideal mate, and without some form of biological intervention, their reproductive success would be left entirely to chance. Plants have overcome this difficulty by evolving floral rewards that balance their success of reproducing with the energetic cost of producing nectar and pollen as a reward for insect pollinators. The primary reward for floral visitors is pollen in an evolutionary sense, and probably the resource for which animals first started visiting flowers. It comes in small, easily managed, nutrient-containing packages, which makes it useful for exploiting as food, and can potentially be collected by almost any animal. It is crucial for the maintenance and development of pollen-eating flies, beetles, and virtually all bees, as it may be their sole source of protein and lipids, or fats. But for other visitors, it is merely an extra reward when they're out foraging for nectar and incidentally pick it up. The functions of pollen for reproduction and reward are mutually incompatible. This is energetically expensive for the plant to produce in terms of the nutrients invested in it and the direct loss of genetic material every time it is eaten. Plants must produce more than they need for reproduction to ensure cross-pollination occurs, and thus it is a balancing act on the part of the plant to attract pollinators and also ensure its reproductive success. In plants where nectar is the primary reward for the pollinator, pollen may be packaged into larger units as opposed to individual grains, which stick to the visitor and get distributed when it visits another flower for nectar. This is most frequent where the main pollinator is a bird, though can also occur in some orchids, which stick a pollinia to their visitors. In the case of some orchids, the flower may trick male bees into visiting them by having petals resembling the female. When the male attempts to mate with the flower, it sticks its pollinia to their bodies, which will pollinate another orchid flower the next time the male is tricked. But how do pollinators know a flower will provide them with their required food sources? Plants co-evolved with their pollinators to advertise their rewards with floral cues, which come in two forms, either visual or olfactory. Visual attraction to flowers is substantially related to flower shape and size. This is because different pollinators have different tongue lengths that determine what kinds of flowers they are able to feed on. In bees, the smaller solitary species, which would include our native yellow-faced bees, have short tongues. This limits the types of flowers they can gather nectar and pollen from to those with an open shape with shallow nectaries that they can easily reach. On the other end of the spectrum are bees with very long tongues, such as bumblebees. These wouldn't be able to feed on open-faced flowers, and instead seek out flowers with a deeper corolla and a landing pad, such as those pictured on the right. Honeybee tongue length falls somewhere in the middle, which is part of what makes them such efficient generalist pollinators. They are able to pollinate many different flower types regardless of floral shape. These are examples of some of the floral shape diversity found in Hawaii. Flowers may be open disc or bowl-shaped, which is the simplest type of flower and the most common across plant families. Here, the petals occur in a single layer with exposed anthers and shallow nectaries, such that both pollen and nectar are freely available to visitors. Tubular flowers have modified petals that are elongated at the base to form a tube, with the outer tips reflexed to form a flattened landing area around and above the tube. This design leads to visual concealment of the nectary, which can only be reached by a visitor with a suitably elongated tongue, such as a bumblebee or in this case a moth. Bilabiate flowers are similar to tubular, with hidden nectaries inside a longer corolla, but have a complex form that requires the pollinator come from a particular direction to land and enter the flower. The pollinator therefore needs good perception of three-dimensional shape, as well as a learning ability to improve its handling of the flower. Often, these types deposit pollen on the head or thorax of the visiting insect and include many orchids. Trumpet and bell-shaped flowers have a more open tube and require the insect visitor's whole body to enter the flower, with the major coevolution factor being flower tube diameter and insect body size. Thus, the visitors are more specialized than those to tubular flowers. Spherical flowers have a distinct shape resulting from fused petals. Keel flowers, like bilabiate, commonly involve specializations for a triggered pollen release. While the petals aren't fused, they have complex folds that the insect must separate with its mouth to reach the nectar. Brush blossoms consist of tens or hundreds of tiny individual flowers packed together, with the protruding anthers forming the conspicuous brush. Pollen is freely available to any who visit. The final example is of composite flowers, which are made up of numerous tiny flowers. Different pollination events may take place over the surface of the flower head on different days and times, which may be carried out by different visitors. Another important visual cue is color, which is determined by floral pigments produced from secondary plant products. Important to note is that the concept of color isn't as straightforward as it seems. Perception of a color results from the visual and sensory processing capabilities of the species viewing it. For example, within the color spectrum, which ranges from ultraviolet to infrared, humans can only see a tiny fraction of all color, which we refer to as visible light. The insect eye contains different photoreceptors than ours, which means they don't see the same range of color as we do. Instead, their visible spectrum ranges from ultraviolet, or UV, to yellow-green, meaning they don't see color in the orange-red part of the spectrum. There are, of course, exceptions. For example, some butterflies see well into red wavelengths, while some moths are effectively colorblind. Something to note about the color spectrum is that within visible light for humans, there is no purple. What we perceive as purple is actually a combination of red and blue. I'm sure we were all finger painting at some point in our lives and mixed red and blue to get purple paint. So when we consider the visible spectrum for a particular species, we can think about it as a circle, with the far left and far right ends actually overlapping. But what about bees? As I mentioned, they see from within the UV spectrum to yellow. The area where UV overlaps with yellow is what bees see as bee purple, and is a color completely unimaginable to humans. On the right is an image of the sunflower Helianthus argophyllus. Image A is photographed in the visible spectrum and represents what we see when looking at the flower. Image B is the same flower, photographed in the UV spectrum, with the additional dark circle representing the area where UV is absorbed, giving us an idea of what a bee may see when visiting this species. Many flowers contain these hidden, to us at least, visual cues, which can serve as nectar guides for bees. These highlight the architecture of the flower during the approach, which can make foraging more efficient. But of course, color can be qualified further than just hue by tint, tone, and shade, all of which will be impacted by ambient light conditions, the time of day, and then also shade that's being cast by other structures. As you can see, Color as a subject can get pretty complicated when you add the physics behind it into the discussion. What you see isn't always what you get, especially when you're trying to get inside the eye of an insect. However, combined with floral shape, this is how plants communicate with pollinators in their visible spectrum in order to advertise nectar and pollen rewards and ensure their own sexual reproduction. But visual cues alone aren't the only way flowers attract pollinators. Insects especially are able to detect and respond to scents or odors. Just like with color, insects perceive more odors than we can. Flowers are capable of producing 1 to 8, but often in excess of 100 unique components that make up their unique scent. However, not all of these constituents may be important for attracting pollinators, and insects are particularly well suited to perceive the essential constituents necessary to determine whether a particular odor mix belongs to a known resource. For example, let's say a bee is foraging in a field of roses. She is cueing in on the various alcohols, sesquiterpenes, esters, and aromatic ethers emanating from the petals, anthers, and pollen in specific ratios, which in addition to color and the open disc shape is why she knows to land on the rose and not, say, the flowering grasses that are growing in between the bushes. All we smell is rose. It is the combination of visual and olfactory cues provided by a flower that forms the basis of what are referred to as pollination syndromes, and often the characteristics of a flower can be used to predict its pollinator. This is a pretty classic example. Charles Darwin received a specimen of a Madagascar orchid, whose name I can't pronounce, and observed that the nectary for this flower was over 11 inches deep. Up until that point, no pollinator had been seen that could fulfill the role of pollination. Darwin predicted that the orchid was pollinated by a moth because no other could possibly have a mouth long enough to reach the nectary. It wasn't until 20 years after Darwin's death in 1903 that the very large moth was discovered, a sphinx moth with a proboscis extending nearly 12 inches. I've mentioned most of the major pollinators so far, which include bees, birds, bats, flies, butterflies, and beetles. Each of these pollinators are seeking out specific floral characteristics which their primary food sources have co-evolved to ensure pollination. The terms aren't necessarily important to remember, but I've included them here for your information. Melitophyly refers to the pollination syndrome of bee-pollinated plants. These plants bloom, or undergo anthesis, when bees are most active at dawn and during the day. These flowers are in the visible spectrum of bees and thus come in pinks, purples, blues, white, and yellow, with nectar guides present to direct the bees to the center of the flower. Flowers will have a moderate scent, usually sweet. Shape-wise, they encompass all the varieties discussed earlier in this lecture, with nectaries both exposed and concealed. Bee plants will produce a medium volume of nectar with a medium concentration of sugars, and middle-of-the-road amounts of pollen as well. Fly pollination syndromes fall into two different categories: myophily, or pollination by flower flies, and sapromyophily, or pollination by carrion and dung flies. For flower flies, their preferred resources bloom during the day with white, yellow, or green flowers. These lack nectar guides and usually don't have much of a smell. The flowers will be flat and radial, such that the nectaries are exposed and easily accessible by the short-tongued flies. These flowers don't have much nectar, but it is more concentrated in sugar. These flowers typically have low to medium amounts of pollen. Flowers that take advantage of carrion and dung flies produce foul odors that take advantage of the odor cues these flies otherwise seek out for laying eggs in dung or decaying flesh. Flowers may bloom day or night and are variable in color, though usually drab without nectar guides. These flowers don't produce nectar, since pollination depends on tricking the fly into visiting it, but they do have medium amounts of pollen. Sapromyophilous flowers are not very common, though one we've all probably heard of is the corpse flower, which may only bloom once a decade. Psychophily and phalanophily refer to pollination syndromes of butterflies and moths. Butterfly flowers bloom during the day, falling in the red, orange, yellow, and mauve part of the color spectrum. They may have nectar guides, depending on whether the plant also wants bees to visit the flowers, and they have a moderate sweet aroma. Because butterflies have long coiled tongues, the flowers they feed on must be small with a long tube, which conceals the nectaries. Small amounts of dilute nectar are produced, and these flowers have low pollen rewards. Flowers pollinated by moths, which typically fly at night, will also bloom at dusk or at night with a strong sweet aroma. Flowers are lighter, white, cream, pale yellow, or light green, as these colors are most visible by moonlight to aid the moths in finding them. As with Psychophilus flowers, they will be radially shaped with a moderate tube concealing the nectaries, which produce low to mid volumes of a low sugar content nectar and very little pollen. Cantharophily refers to beetle-pollinated flowers. Following the biology of their preferred pollinator, flowers bloom either during the day or at night with dull cream or green-colored flowers. These will have a strong odor, either fruity or fermenting smelling, and have radial flat flowers with exposed nectaries, as beetles do not have mouth adaptations allowing them to reach into deeper flowers. Nectar sugars are a medium concentration with low volume, and pollen is produced in medium to high amounts. Though beetles can be pollinators in some instances, they also destroy flower parts while feeding, so it isn't a pollination syndrome encountered as frequently as some of the others. Many tropical flowers are actually bird-pollinated or ornithophilous. These day-blooming flowers are red or orange and lack nectar guides as well as any discernible smell. Nectar is concealed in short or medium tubes of bilateral or radial flowers that produce a high volume of low sugar content nectar. These flowers also produce low amounts of pollen. Another characteristic of these flowers is that they tend to have modified petals that are very stiff in order to accommodate a perching bird. Finally, bat-pollinated flowers bloom at dusk or night and only bloom for a single night. As previously mentioned for moths, because these are night-blooming flowers, they are dull white or a beige-green in color with no nectar guides and smell strongly of fermenting fruit. They may be bilateral or radial and bowl or brush-shaped. Nectaries are exposed and produce a high volume of low to mid-concentration sugars in the nectar. These flowers also produce copious amounts of pollen. As previously mentioned, bat pollination is important elsewhere in the world, like the southwestern US and in Asia, but we do not have pollinating bats in Hawaii. Pollination is essential for the propagation of food, fiber, and oil, and understanding pollination syndromes is important to make sure appropriate habitat is available in agricultural areas to support pollinators. Agriculture in Hawaii would not exist without introduced pollinators, though there is one unique example of how a native pollinator has been co-opted for specialty crop production. I'm speaking, of course, about cacao production and the chocolate midge. Cacao has a very unique floral structure that can only be navigated by a type of fly called a midge in the genus Forsythomyia, and we happen to have one here in Hawaii. There are currently less than 150 acres of cacao grown in the state, making Hawaiian chocolate the rarest in the world. We are also the only state with a climate capable of cacao production. In the previous module, I spent some time discussing the importance of pollinators, honeybees especially, in the pollination of coffee and macadamia. I mentioned then that cucumber is the 12th most valuable crop in Hawaii, valued at $6.5 million annually. Cucurbit crops originated in the southwestern and Central America from a plant called buffalo gourd. In its native range, the buffalo gourd and other cucurbits are pollinated by solitary bee specialists belonging to Xenoglossa and Pepinapis. We do not have these bee species in Hawaii and instead rely upon honeybees for pollination, though they are not the most effective. In a study from Mexico, the authors counted the number of pollen grains that were transferred between cucumber flowers by honeybees and the males and females of Pepinapis pruinosa. Females were significantly more effective pollinators, though males and honeybees do still confer a degree of pollination service. In Hawaii, even though honeybees may not be the best, what they lack in efficiency they make up for in sheer numbers, and we get locally grown cucumbers and melons. Okay, quick pop quiz here at the end. This is the image of a flower from a crop plant commonly consumed in Hawaii. Take a moment and guess, based on the floral structure, what you think pollinates this plant. This is an up-close picture of mango, whose flowers have an open disc shape with exposed nectaries and a yellowish-green color. They're pollinated by flies. Honeybees can be seen foraging in mango trees when they are in bloom, but they may not be very efficient at providing pollination services in this case. So if you have a mango tree in your yard and aren't seeing as many mangoes as you like, consider planting fly-attractive flowers in your yard to encourage pollinating flies year-round, which can then pollinate your mangoes when they flower. This concludes the second Advanced Pollinator Training module. For those of you pursuing the advanced certification for the Hawaii Master Gardeners, don't forget to take Quiz 2 found under Lesson Materials. You need a score of 70% or greater for credit. For much of the remainder of the course, the focus will be on bees, with our next lecture covering bee reproduction and life cycles.